Thaddeus Stauffer Langston stood in his office looking out the window at the city below. He was 45 years old and had everything he could want. Lots of money, a big company called Langston Enterprises, and people said he was one of the most eligible bachelors. But tonight, something felt different. His assistant, Lily Morgan, knocked on the door. "Your dinner reservation at Café Belle Terre is in an hour, and the board members are already on their way," she said. Thaddeus adjusted his tie and grabbed his jacket. Another dinner with business people, he thought to himself. This is my life now. Meetings, deals, and more meetings. "Thank you, Lily Morgan. You can head home now," Thaddeus said, smiling at her. She had worked with him for 15 years and probably knew him better than anyone else. Lily Morgan paused at the door. "One more thing, sir? A letter came today from Carter and Associates law firm," she said. Thaddeus froze. Carter, he thought. He hadn't heard that name in years. It was the name of his ex-wife, Elowen Ford Carter. His heart started beating faster. He didn't want to think about her, but there she was in a letter. "Just put it on my desk," he said, trying to sound calm, but his hands were shaking. After Lily Morgan left, Thaddeus picked up the letter. He didn't even need to open it to know who it was from. It was from Elowen Ford, the woman he had loved but lost. He remembered their small apartment when they first got married, her laughter, and how she used to bring him coffee in bed every morning. But their fights grew bigger, and one day she left him. She said she couldn't compete with his need to be successful. He put the letter in his desk drawer, telling himself he had a dinner to get to and important people were waiting. At the restaurant, everything looked fancy: crystal chandeliers, soft music, and waiters who moved quietly. Thaddeus sat at the head of the table, laughing at jokes he didn't think were funny and making small talk with people he didn't know. One of the board members, Harold, was saying the stock wasn't worth anything. Everyone laughed. Then Thaddeus saw her, Elowen Ford. She was sitting 3 tables away, looking just as beautiful as when they were married. She was having dinner with someone, but that wasn't what caught Thaddeus's attention. He heard children laughing, 3 children, all about 5 years old, sitting with her, 2 girls and a boy. They had Elowen Ford's smile, but something about them made Thaddeus's heart stop. The boy's eyes looked just like his. One of the girls tilted her head the same way Elowen Ford used to. Thaddeus could hardly breathe. He counted in his mind, 5 years. Elowen Ford had left him 6 years ago. These kids had to be his. Why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't he known? "Are you okay, Mr. Langston?" Harold asked. Thaddeus stood up so suddenly his chair almost tipped over. "I need some air," he said, but instead of going to the door, he walked straight to Elowen Ford's table. When she looked up and saw him, she didn't look angry or happy, just careful. "Thaddeus," she said quietly. The children looked up at him, curious. He couldn't finish his question. "Are they?" he started, but couldn't say the rest. Elowen Ford's face changed. "They're mine," she said firmly. One of the girls asked, "Mommy, who's that?" Elowen Ford answered, but her eyes never left Thaddeus. "Someone Mommy used to know." Thaddeus felt like the room was spinning. These children, they looked so perfect, so much like him and Elowen Ford. How had he not known? "We need to talk," he said, his voice trembling. "No, we don't," Elowen Ford replied, but her voice shook too. "You made your choice a long time ago, Thaddeus. You chose your company over me, over us." Thaddeus lowered his voice, aware of the people around them. "Mine," Elowen Ford repeated firmly. "They're mine." She looked at him with determination. "I tried to reach you, Thaddeus. When I found out I was pregnant, I called your office a lot. I wrote letters, but you didn't answer. You had changed your number. Your assistant told me you were too busy." Thaddeus remembered that time. After Elowen Ford left, he threw himself into work. He even changed his number, hoping to avoid the pain of losing her. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Would it have made a difference?" Elowen Ford asked. "If I had told you?" Before he could answer, one of the girls asked, "Mommy, can we have dessert now?" You promised. Elowen Ford smiled softly at her daughter. Of course, sweetie. Why don't you three look at the dessert menu and pick something special? As the children looked at the menu, Thaddeus couldn't help but notice how much they looked like him and Elowen Ford. What are their names? He asked. Elowen Ford sighed. Zoe Parker and Izzy are the girls, and Max is the boy. Thaddeus's heart sank. Max, he repeated. That was his father's name. Had Elowen Ford done that on purpose? They're beautiful, Thaddeus said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, they are. Elowen Ford agreed quietly. And they're happy. We're happy. Thaddeus felt a tightness in his chest. Please, Elowen Ford, we need to talk about this. Really talk. But Elowen Ford shook her head. No, you've made your choice, Thaddeus. She paused. But if you're serious, if you really want to be part of their lives, I'll give you a chance. She pulled out a business card and handed it to him. Call me tomorrow. Not for us, but for them. Back at his table, Thaddeus could feel everyone staring at him. His perfect world felt empty now, compared to what he had just seen. His children, his family. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't just ignore them. That night, he couldn't sleep. All he could think about were their faces, his children. He had missed out on so much. The next morning, he went into his office early. Lily Morgan was already there, as always. Lily Morgan, he said, tell me the truth. Did Elowen Ford try to contact me 5 years ago? Lily Morgan looked at him with concern. Yes, sir. Many times. And what happened to those messages? Miss Reynolds, your assistant at the time, said you didn't want to be disturbed by your ex-wife. She returned all the letters and blocked the calls. Thaddeus sank into his chair. Why didn't you tell me this before? Lily Morgan hesitated. I thought you knew what you were doing. You never mentioned Elowen Ford. Thaddeus pulled out the business card Elowen Ford had given him. I want every letter, every message Elowen Ford sent. Everything. Sir, that was 5 years ago. Miss Reynolds might not have kept them. Thaddeus interrupted. Do whatever it takes. Later that day, Thaddeus stood outside Elowen Ford's office building. It was small and simple, nothing like his huge company, but it had character. The receptionist led him into Elowen Ford's office, and when she saw him, she didn't look surprised. You came, she said. Did you think I wouldn't? He asked. I wasn't sure, she answered. The Thaddeus I knew would have done anything to be here, but after you changed, I didn't know. Thaddeus told her about Miss Reynolds and the letters. Does that make a difference? It makes all the difference, Elowen Ford said. Thaddeus asked softly, Tell me about them, our kids. Elowen Ford opened a drawer and pulled out a photo album. Zoe Parker is the oldest by 2 minutes. She's always drawing. Izzy is our little scientist, always asking how things work. And Max, he's just like you were before everything changed. Thaddeus looked at the pictures, first steps, first words, first day of school, moments he had missed. They've asked about their father, Elowen Ford said. I've told them you were someone I loved very much, but you had to go away. Thaddeus's voice was soft. Tell them the truth. Tell them their dad was a fool who lost his way but wants to make things right. Elowen Ford hesitated. But what happens when the next big deal comes along, when your company needs you more than they do? Thaddeus stood up and took her hand. I was wrong about everything. I thought success was all about having the biggest company, the most money. But sitting at that restaurant last night, seeing our kids laugh, that was worth more than all the money I have. Elowen Ford's eyes filled with tears. I wanted to tell you so many times, but you made it clear you didn't want us. I'm sorry, Thaddeus said, his voice breaking. I know my words aren't enough, but I'm sorry. His phone buzzed. It was Lily Morgan, but Thaddeus turned it off without hesitation. Don't you need to get that? Elowen Ford asked. No, he said firmly. Nothing is more important than this. Elowen Ford looked at him for a long time. There's a school play next week that Zoe Parker is the smart pig in the Three Little Pigs. Can I come? Thaddeus smiled. I'll be there. Elowen Ford's voice stopped him as he stood to leave. If we do this, if we let you into their lives, you have to be sure, really sure, because if you disappear like you did with me, I won't let you hurt them. Thaddeus promised, I'm done running. Thaddeus turned on his phone and the screen lit up with a bunch of messages and missed calls. Important people wanted to talk to him, deals needed to be made, and money was waiting to be earned. But for the first time, Thaddeus didn't care about any of that. He called his assistant, Lily Morgan. Cancel everything next week, he said, and find me some books about being a good dad. Also, what do 5-year-olds like? What toys? What games? I need to learn everything. Of course, Mr. Langston, Lily Morgan replied with a smile in her voice. And sir, it's good to see the old you again. Thaddeus looked back at Elowen Ford's office building. Somewhere in the city, 3 little kids were going about their day, not knowing their dad's heart was already full of love for them. He had a lot to fix, a lot to prove. But this time, he was ready to fight for what really mattered. The school auditorium was packed with parents holding phones and cameras. They were all excited to watch a play called The 3 Little Pigs. Thaddeus sat nervously in the 3rd row on the left, just where Elowen Ford told him to sit. He had skipped 3 big meetings and a huge business deal to be here, and for once, he didn't regret it. Elowen Ford arrived with the kids, all dressed in costumes. She saw him right away, but wasn't surprised. Thaddeus had texted her every day that week to make sure he had the right time and place. Remember, she whispered as she passed him, they don't know who you are yet. We agreed to take it slow. Thaddeus nodded. He was just another face in the crowd today, but his heart almost burst with pride when Zoe Parker came on stage dressed as the pig who built a brick house. She said all her lines perfectly, even wagging her finger at her siblings about building strong houses. Izzy and Max sat in the audience with Elowen Ford cheering for their sister. After the play, Thaddeus stayed back watching parents congratulate their kids. He wanted so badly to run to Zoe Parker, tell her how amazing she was, and hug all 3 of them. But he had promised Elowen Ford they would take it slow. A teacher walked up to him. Mr. Langston, she said, I'm Mrs. Thompson, the kids' teacher. Thaddeus froze. Does Elowen Ford know you're talking to me? The teacher smiled kindly. She told me you might be here and explained the situation. They're wonderful children. You should be proud. I am, Thaddeus said, his voice shaking. I just wish. It's never too late to be a good father, Mrs. Thompson said softly. Just be patient. They're worth it. Over the next few weeks, Thaddeus learned how to be patient. He started by sending secret gifts to their school. Art supplies for Zoe Parker's class, a science kit for Izzy's after-school program, and sports equipment for the playground where Max liked to play. Elowen Ford knew the gifts were from him, of course. They were so excited about the new soccer balls, she told him during one of their weekly coffee meetings. These meetings became their time to talk about the kids and plan the next steps. And the art supplies? Thaddeus asked eagerly. Zoe Parker hasn't put those new pencils down since they arrived. She's already filled half a sketchbook. Thaddeus smiled, imagining Zoe Parker drawing. I'd love to see her artwork sometime. Elowen Ford hesitated, then pulled out her phone. Here, she said, showing him a picture. She drew this yesterday. It was a drawing of 3 pigs doing regular things, painting, reading, and playing soccer. It's them, Thaddeus realized. She drew herself and her siblings. She's very observant, Elowen Ford said. All 3 of them are. They notice everything. Have they asked about me? Thaddeus asked softly. The man from the restaurant? Elowen Ford stirred her coffee. Izzy asked if you were one of my clients. Max said you looked familiar, like someone from a dream. Thaddeus's heart ached. And Zoe Parker? Elowen Ford smiled slightly. Zoe Parker said you had kind eyes. Tears filled Thaddeus's kind eyes. When can I meet them? Really meet them? Soon, Elowen Ford promised. But first, there's something we need to talk about. She pulled out 3 folders from her bag. Each folder had one of the kids' names on it. These are their medical records, school reports, everything you should know. Izzy has mild allergies. Max is afraid of thunderstorms. Zoe Parker has asthma. Thaddeus held the folders like they were treasure. I'll memorize every word. There's more, Elowen Ford said. Izzy has a science fair next month. Max has soccer practice every Tuesday and Thursday. Zoe Parker has art classes on Wednesdays. Their world doesn't run on business hours, Thaddeus. They need consistency. I'll rearrange everything, Thaddeus said without hesitation. Lily Morgan's already helping me reorganize my schedule. And what about your board? Won't they be upset? Thaddeus's face hardened. Let them. I've given that company 15 years. It's time I gave something to my family instead. The word family hung between them, heavy with meaning. They weren't a couple anymore, but they were connected by something stronger than romance. 3 kids who deserved the best from both their parents. That night, Thaddeus sat in his fancy penthouse, spreading the folders out on his coffee table. He ordered pizza, something he hadn't done in years, and spent the night learning everything about his kids. Izzy was allergic to strawberries and peanuts. Max had won a Most Improved Player award in soccer. Zoe Parker's artwork had been displayed in the school hallway. His phone buzzed with business calls, but he ignored them all. Instead, he made notes: soccer gear in Max's size, art supplies for Zoe Parker, science books for Izzy. Not to send to school, but to keep at his place, just in case they ever wanted to visit their dad. The next morning, Thaddeus called his real estate agent. The penthouse isn't right, he said. I need something more family-friendly, a house with a yard near good schools. But sir, you just renovated last year, the agent said, surprised. Things change, Thaddeus said, looking at one of Zoe Parker's crayon drawings. People change. Later that week, during their regular coffee meeting, Elowen Ford looked worried. What's wrong? Thaddeus asked. It's Max, she said. There's a Father's Day event at school next week. My brother Tom usually takes him, but this morning Max asked why he doesn't have a dad like his friends. Thaddeus's heart hurt. What did you say? I told him that families come in all shapes and sizes. Some kids have 2 parents, some have 1, some have more, but Elowen Ford looked directly at him. I think it's time. Time, Thaddeus asked, his heart pounding. Time for you to meet them, properly, not as a stranger, but as, she took a deep breath, as their dad. Thaddeus felt like his heart might burst. Are you sure? No, Elowen Ford admitted. But they deserve to know, and you've proven you're serious. You've been learning about them, showing up, and trying. When? He asked, barely able to speak. This Saturday, I'm taking them to the park. They love the playground there. Thaddeus smiled. He had just helped donate new equipment to that playground. Thank you, he said softly. Don't thank me yet, Elowen Ford warned. This is just the beginning. It won't be easy. They might be scared, confused, or even angry. We need to be ready. We'll handle it together, Thaddeus said. Together as parents, Elowen Ford agreed. Not as, I know, Thaddeus said quickly, just as parents. Saturday morning came, and Thaddeus barely slept the night before. He spent hours practicing what he would say. Now, standing in his closet, he faced one last problem. What should a dad wear to meet his kids for the first time? His phone rang. It was his mom. Thaddeus Stouffer, why did you cancel that big deal? She asked. The board says you've changed. Maybe I have, Thaddeus said, picking out a simple blue sweater. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Elena's voice turned cold as she spoke on the phone. I saw you at Café Belterre 2 weeks ago with Elowen Ford. Thaddeus froze. You were there? I was having dinner with the Whitakers. I saw you walk to her table. Those children, she paused. Tell me they're not yours. Thaddeus took a deep breath. They are, he said firmly. You have 3 grandchildren, Mother. Triplets. Their names are Zoe Parker, Izzy, and Max. The silence from Elena was so heavy it felt like it filled the room. Then she said angrily, How dare she keep this from us? We'll sue for custody. We're the Langstons. We have rights. No, Thaddeus's voice was sharp. You will not do that. Elowin Ford has raised them perfectly without us, without me. If anyone should be angry, it's them. But the company, Elena began. The company is just a company, Thaddeus interrupted. These are my children, your grandchildren. If you want to be part of their lives, you'll respect how Elowin Ford and I handle things. He hung up before she could say more. His hands were shaking. He should have known his mother would make things hard. The Langstons were not used to hearing no. Later that morning, Thaddeus arrived early at the park. He sat on a bench, watching other families. A father was teaching his daughter to ride a bike. A mother was pushing her son on the swings. These were simple moments Thaddeus had missed. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his sister, Lily Morgan. Your father is at the office. He wants to see you. Thaddeus typed back, I'm busy meeting my children. A few minutes later, Elowin Ford's car pulled into the parking lot. Thaddeus's heart raced when he saw the kids get out. The children wore bright raincoats, purple for Zoe Parker, yellow for Izzy, and blue for Max. They ran toward the playground, laughing. Elowin Ford walked more slowly behind them. Are you ready? Elowin Ford asked when she reached Thaddeus. No, he admitted, but I don't want to wait another minute. They walked to the playground together. The children were already playing. Max was on the swings, and the girls were taking turns on the slide. Kids, Elowin Ford called softly. Can you come here for a minute? There's someone I want you to meet. The triplets ran over, curious but not shy. Up close, Thaddeus noticed their features. Izzy had a small freckle under her left eye, just like him. Max's hair fell across his forehead the same way Thaddeus's did. Zoe Parker had her mother's dimples. This is Mr. Langston, Elowin Ford began, then paused. Thaddeus Stouffer, and he's your father. The children stared at him. Max's mouth fell open. Izzy grabbed Zoe Parker's hand. Zoe Parker tilted her head and studied him with wise eyes. You're our daddy? Max asked finally. Thaddeus knelt down to their level. Yes, I am. I know I haven't been here, and I'm so sorry, but I want to be here now, if you'll let me. Izzy's voice was small but clear. Where were you? Thaddeus glanced at Elowin Ford for help, but she shook her head. They had agreed to be honest. I was being foolish, Thaddeus admitted. I thought being successful was more important than family. I was wrong. Family matters. You matter. Do you have other kids? Zoe Parker asked. No, Thaddeus said softly, just you three, and you're everything to me. Before anyone could say more, a sharp voice interrupted. Thaddeus Stouffer? Elena Langston was striding across the park with David, Thaddeus's father, following behind. They were dressed in business clothes, looking out of place among the families. Mother, don't, Thaddeus warned, standing up. These are our grandchildren, Elena announced, looking at the triplets with a mix of pride and calculation. They should be at home, not in a public park. Mrs. Langston, Elowin Ford said coolly, this isn't the time or place. Oh, it speaks, Elena sneered. Tell me, dear, how much money did you think you'd get by hiding our grandchildren from us? The triplets pressed closer to Elowin Ford, frightened by Elena's tone. Thaddeus stepped between them and his parents. You will not speak to Elowin Ford that way, Thaddeus said, his voice low and dangerous. She has been a wonderful mother. She protected them, loved them, gave them everything they needed. Where were you? Where was I? Son, David began, be reasonable. Think of the scandal. We need to handle this with lawyers. No, Thaddeus said firmly. He turned to the children. I'm so sorry about this. This isn't how I wanted to meet you, but I want you to know something. Your mom is the strongest, bravest person I know. Everything she's done for you. Zoe Parker suddenly stepped forward and slipped her small hand into Thaddeus's. Your eyes are sad, she said simply. That simple statement and her innocent touch broke something in Thaddeus. Tears ran down his face. I am sad, he admitted. Sad that I missed so much. Sad that I'm only meeting you now. but also very happy that I get to meet you at all. Izzy and Max moved closer, curious rather than afraid. Elena started to speak again, but David stopped her. Elena, look at them. The children stood with Thaddeus, looking up at him with questions in their eyes. Ella and Ford watched carefully, ready to step in if needed. Can we call you Daddy? Max asked suddenly. Thaddeus looked at Ella and Ford, who nodded. I would love that, Thaddeus said, his voice breaking, but only if you want to. We can take it slow and get to know each other first. I want to know everything, Izzy declared. Do you like science? I love science, especially space, Thaddeus replied. And soccer? Max added hopefully. And drawing? Zoe Parker chimed in. Thaddeus laughed through his tears. I want to know everything about you too. Everything you like and don't like. All your favorite things. Elena and David stood awkwardly to the side, watching their son bond with his children. Finally, Elena's face softened. They have your eyes, she said quietly to Thaddeus. All three of them. They have a lot more than that, Ella and Ford said. They have his kindness, creativity, and spirit. Everything good about Thaddeus before the business world changed him. She looked at Thaddeus with hope. Now maybe they'll have their father too. The rain that had been threatening all morning began to fall, soft and gentle. No one moved. 3 generations of the Langston family stood in the rain, watching something broken begin to heal. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and sometimes a start is all you need. In the weeks that followed, life changed for everyone. Thaddeus bought a house just 10 minutes from Ella and Ford's. It had a big backyard and a room for each of the kids. He let them pick their wall colors, deep purple for Zoe Parker, sky blue for Izzy, and forest green for Max. Today was their first overnight visit. Thaddeus was nervous. The EpiPen for Izzy's allergies is in the kitchen drawer, Ella and Ford reminded him for the 3rd time. And Zoe Parker's inhaler is in my pocket, Thaddeus finished. And Max might get scared if there's thunder, but reading him a story helps, I remember. Ella and Ford nodded, but still looked worried. This was her first night away from them. Mommy will be fine, Izzy said, hugging her. Daddy has a telescope. He's going to show us the stars. The word daddy still made Thaddeus's heart skip a beat. The kids used it naturally now, though they sometimes called him Thaddeus. He treasured both. And he got art supplies, Zoe Parker added excitedly. Real artist ones. And a soccer goal in the backyard. Max couldn't hide his excitement. Ella and Ford smiled despite her worry. Okay, you 3, be good. Call me if you need anything. After she left, Thaddeus looked at his children and felt a moment of panic. What did he know about being a dad? Can we have pizza? Max asked, hopefully. Thaddeus laughed, relieved. Pizza I can handle. What kind do you like? Cheese, pepperoni, everything except anchovies. They all spoke at once, and Thaddeus relaxed. They were just kids, his kids, and they wanted to spend time with him. While waiting for the pizza, Izzy found his home office. What's all this? She asked, pointing at his computer screens. That's what I do for work, Thaddeus explained. I help companies grow. Is that why you weren't with us? Izzy's question was innocent but hit Thaddeus hard. Partly, he admitted. I thought being successful meant making lots of money. But I was wrong. Being successful means being there for the people you love. Izzy thought about this. Like how Mommy always comes to our school plays? Exactly like that. Thaddeus's voice caught. I'm sorry I missed those plays, but I won't miss any more. I promise. Izzy's eyes were serious. Promise? Promise, Thaddeus said firmly. When the pizza arrived, they ate in the living room, something Thaddeus had never done before. The kids told him about school, their friends, and their dreams. I want to be an astronaut and discover new planets, Izzy said. I'm going to play soccer in the Olympics, Max declared. I want to paint pictures that make people happy, Zoe Parker said softly. Thaddeus listened to each dream. You can be anything you want to be, he told them. I'll help you get there. After dinner, they set up the telescope on the back porch. Thaddeus pointed out constellations. That's Orion, See his belt? 3 stars in a row. Like us, Zoe Parker exclaimed. We're 3 in a row, too. Yeah, Max said. I'm the middle star. No, I am, Izzy argued. Actually, Thaddeus said, you're all special stars, shining in your own way. The kids loved this idea. They made up their own constellations. Thaddeus took pictures to share with Elowen Ford, wanting her to be part of the moment. Bedtime was harder. The kids were nervous about sleeping in a new place. Can we all sleep in the same room? Max asked, clutching his stuffed dog. Please? The girls nodded. Thaddeus thought for a moment. How about we make a fort in the living room instead? Yes, the kids cheered. They built the fort with blankets, pillows, and Thaddeusmas lights. Thaddeus had found in a closet. He read them 3 stories, one for each child, until their eyes grew heavy. Just as they were falling asleep, thunder rumbled outside. Max tensed. It's okay, Thaddeus soothed, pulling him close. Remember the stars? Thunder is just the sky saying hello. That's not scientific, Izzy mumbled sleepily. No, Thaddeus agreed, but sometimes it's okay to believe in a little magic. The children were finally asleep, snuggled under blankets after their exciting day, but Thaddeus stayed awake. He sat nearby, watching their small chests rise and fall as they breathed. It made him feel peaceful and happy. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from Elowen Ford. Everything okay? Thaddeus smiled. He quickly sent her the photos he had taken of their stargazing adventure earlier that night. He added a message, all good, they're amazing. Elowen Ford, you've done such a wonderful job with them. Her reply came quickly. We did make beautiful children, didn't we? Thaddeus smiled again. In the quiet of the night, he texted back, yes, we did. The next morning, Thaddeus woke up and noticed Zoe Parker was already awake. She was sitting in a corner of the room, quietly drawing on a piece of paper. Curious, Thaddeus got up and walked over to see her work. Zoe Parker had drawn a perfect picture of their blanket fort from the night before. In her picture, there were 3 small figures sleeping inside the fort, and 1 larger figure watching over them. Is that us? Thaddeus asked softly, trying not to wake Max and Izzy. Zoe Parker nodded and smiled. It's our first night as a real family, she said. Thaddeus felt a lump in his throat and tears filled his eyes. These days he seemed to cry more often, but they were happy tears. Can I keep this drawing? He asked. I want to frame it and put it in my office. Zoe Parker tilted her head, looking curious. Your work office? She asked. Yes, Thaddeus replied. So when I'm there, I can always remember what really matters. Later that morning, Elowen Ford arrived to pick up the kids. When she walked into the house, she found them all in the kitchen, trying to make pancakes. There was flour all over the counters, the floor, and even in Izzy's hair. The pancakes were oddly shaped, but everyone was laughing and having fun. Mommy, Izzy and Max shouted, running over to hug Elowen Ford. We saw stars last night, and we made a fort, and Daddy let us put chocolate chips in the pancakes. Elowen Ford raised an eyebrow at Thaddeus, who shrugged with a sheepish smile. It was a special occasion, he said. Can we come back next weekend? Max asked, looking hopeful. Please, Izzy and Zoe Parker chimed in. Elowen Ford glanced at Thaddeus. He tried to keep his face neutral, but she could see the hope in his eyes. After a moment, she smiled and said, We'll see. Maybe next time we can all have dinner together. Thaddeus's heart skipped a beat. He knew this wasn't about romance. They were clear that part of their relationship was over. But it meant Elowen Ford was starting to trust him with the kids. As Elowen Ford and the children were leaving, Izzy turned back and said, Daddy, will you come to my science fair next week? I'm doing a project about the stars we saw. Thaddeus knelt down to her level and smiled. I wouldn't miss it for the world, he promised. When they were gone, Thaddeus stood in the middle of his house. It was the messiest it had ever been. Blankets were scattered everywhere. Dishes were piled in the sink, and flour was still on the floor. But for the first time, the house felt like a home. Thaddeus went to his office and carefully pinned Zoe Parker's drawing on the wall above his computer. Then, he picked up his phone and called his assistant, Lily Morgan. "Cancel my Tuesday morning meetings," he said. "My daughter has a science fair." "Of course, Mr. Langston," Lily Morgan replied warmly. "Should I get flowers for her?" Thaddeus smiled. "No, get a chemistry set instead." "And Lily Morgan?" "Yes?" "Thank you," Thaddeus said softly. "For what?" "For understanding," he replied. Thaddeus looked at Zoe Parker's drawing again. In it, there were 3 small stars and 1 big one, all under the same roof. It wasn't the kind of success he had once dreamed of, but it was better. So much better. One Tuesday morning, Thaddeus was working in his office, reviewing contracts, when his phone rang. Seeing Elowyn Ford's name on the screen, he smiled, thinking she was calling about their family dinner planned for that evening. But when he answered, her voice was full of panic. "Thaddeus," she said. Her words rushed. "It's Zoe Parker. They're taking her to the hospital." Thaddeus stood up quickly. "What happened?" he asked, grabbing his car keys. "Her asthma," Elowyn Ford said. "It's really bad this time. We're in the ambulance now." Thaddeus could hear sirens and Zoe Parker's labored breathing in the background. "Which hospital?" he asked. "St. Mary's," Elowyn Ford replied. "She's so scared." "I'm on my way," Thaddeus said firmly. He ran out of his office, passing Lily Morgan's desk. "Cancel everything," he said quickly. "Family emergency." The drive to the hospital felt like it took forever. Thaddeus ran 3 red lights, not caring about the tickets he might get. All he could think about was Zoe Parker. He had only been a father for a few months, and the thought of losing her terrified him. At the hospital, Thaddeus found Elowyn Ford in the emergency room. She was sitting with Izzy and Max, holding them close. The twins looked frightened. "Where is she?" Thaddeus asked, his voice shaking. They took her back there," Elowyn Ford said, pointing to a set of double doors. "They wouldn't let me go with her. They said her oxygen levels were too low." Thaddeus pulled Elowyn Ford and the twins into a tight hug. "She's going to be okay," he said firmly. "She has to be okay." Hours passed in the waiting room. Izzy and Max eventually fell asleep in the uncomfortable chairs, but Thaddeus and Elowyn Ford stayed awake. "I should have noticed," Elowyn Ford said quietly, her voice full of guilt. "She was wheezing last night, but I thought her inhaler would be enough." "Don't blame yourself," Thaddeus said gently. "You're an amazing mom." "Some mom," Elowyn Ford said bitterly. "I couldn't even protect her from this." Thaddeus reached over and took her hand. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "We handled this together, remember?" Finally, a doctor came out. "Mr. and Mrs. Langston?" They both stood up quickly. "How is she?" they asked at the same time. "She's stable now," the doctor said. "It was a severe asthma attack. We've started her on medication, but we'd like to keep her overnight for observation." "Can we see her?" Thaddeus asked. The doctor nodded. "She's been asking for both of you." They gently woke Izzy and Max and followed the doctor to Zoe Parker's room. She looked so small in the hospital bed, with tubes in her nose and monitors beeping around her. "Daddy," she whispered when she saw Thaddeus. "You came." Thaddeus hurried to her side and took her hand. "Of course I came, sweetheart. I'll always come when you need me." "Both of you," Zoe Parker said with a tired smile, looking at her parents. Thaddeus and Elowyn Ford shared a glance. Even in the hospital, Zoe Parker was trying to bring them closer. The night passed slowly. The twins fell asleep again, curled up together in a chair. Thaddeus and Elowyn Ford sat on either side of Zoe Parker's bed, not wanting to leave her alone. "Do you remember when they were born?" Elowyn Ford asked softly, breaking the silence. "They were so tiny." Thaddeus nodded, regret washing over him. "I wish I had been there," he said quietly. "You're here now," Elowyn Ford replied gently, "when it matters." Morning finally came, and the doctor had good news. Zoe Parker's breathing had improved, and she could go home the next day. However, she would need more aggressive treatment for her asthma, including daily nebulizer treatments. "I'll get the best specialists," Thaddeus promised. "Whatever she needs." Ella Ford hesitated. We can handle the cost, she started to say, but Thaddeus stopped her. Please let me do this, he said. Not because I'm throwing money at the problem, but because she's my daughter and I love her. I love all of them. Ella Ford studied him for a moment, then nodded. Okay, she said, but on one condition, we do this as a team. Every decision we make together. Thaddeus smiled. Later, as Zoe Parker slept peacefully, Thaddeus stepped into the hallway. He pulled out his phone and began typing an email to his company's board of directors. Effective immediately, I am stepping back from day-to-day operations. My family needs me, and for the first time in my life, I'm choosing what really matters. Thaddeus pressed send without hesitation. For the first time, success wasn't about work or money. Izzy looked at her mom, Ella Ford, and asked, Mommy, can we stay here tonight, please? The kids had been going back and forth between their mom and dad's houses, but ever since Zoe Parker had been in the hospital, they wanted to stay together more. Actually, Thaddeus, their dad, said, I've been thinking about something. He led them to the living room, where they all sat on their favorite big couch for family meetings. This house is too big for just me, Thaddeus said, and Zoe Parker needs both her parents nearby for her treatments. What if we made this our family home, all of us? The kids' eyes lit up with excitement, but Ella Ford looked nervous. Thaddeus quickly added, Not like that. I asked a contractor, and we can make 2 separate homes here. You and the kids can have the main house, and I can live in the guest house out back. We'd have our own spaces, but be close for Zoe Parker's treatments. I want that, Max shouted. Then we could play soccer in the backyard every day. And use the telescope, Izzy added. And paint together, Zoe Parker said softly. Ella Ford looked at their hopeful faces. Can I think about it? Of course, Thaddeus said. No pressure, it's just an idea. That night, after the kids were asleep, Ella Ford found Thaddeus in the kitchen. Did you really mean what you said? She asked. Completely separate spaces, he assured her. I know we're not getting back together, Ella Ford. I respect that. This is about the kids. She sat at the kitchen island. You're different now, she said. I had to be, Thaddeus replied. When I saw Zoe Parker in the hospital, I finally understood what you tried to tell me years ago. Success means nothing if you don't have people to share it with. Ella Ford gave a small smile. Just then, they heard coughing from upstairs. Both parents rushed to Zoe Parker's room. She was sitting up in bed, coughing a little. I got it, Thaddeus said, grabbing her nebulizer. He sat beside her, holding the mask to her face while Ella Ford got her art supplies ready. Tell me a story, Zoe Parker said through the mask. Which one? Thaddeus asked. The one about how you and Mommy met, Zoe Parker said. Thaddeus and Ella Ford exchanged a look. They had never told their kids that story. Well, Thaddeus began, it was a rainy day, much like today. As he told the story of meeting Ella Ford in a coffee shop during law school, Izzy and Max wandered in and sat on the bed, listening. And then Daddy got silly and spilled coffee all over himself, Ella Ford added, making the kids giggle. Only because you made me nervous, Thaddeus defended himself. You were the prettiest girl I'd ever seen. Are you still in love? Izzy asked innocently. Thaddeus and Ella Ford paused. Finally, Ella Ford said, We love each other differently now, as your parents and as friends. That's okay, Zoe Parker said wisely, as long as we're together. Later that night, Ella Ford looked at the house plans Thaddeus had drawn. The guest house really would be separate, Thaddeus said. You wouldn't even have to see me if you didn't want to. Ella Ford smiled. That's not what I want. The kids need both of us, and you've proven you can be the father they deserve. Is that a yes? It's a let's try it, Ella Ford said. Thaddeus nodded. This wasn't about romance. It was about family. The next morning, he called the contractor to start the renovations. Moving day was busy. Movers carried furniture, and workers were finishing up the guest house. The kids ran around excitedly. Be careful, Elowin Ford called as Max and Izzy almost bumped into a man carrying paint cans. "I got them," Thaddeus said, picking up Max under one arm and Izzy under the other. Zoe Parker followed, laughing. "Put us down," Izzy squealed. "Should I, Zoe Parker?" Thaddeus teased. "Only if they help me organize my art supplies," Zoe Parker said with a grin. On the porch, Thaddeus's mom, Sophia, watched. She had come to help but was just standing there, watching her son laugh and play with his kids. Elowin Ford joined her. "He's different with them, isn't he?" Elowin Ford asked. Sophia nodded. "I haven't seen him laugh like that since before you left." "He's found his way back to himself," Elowin Ford said. Sophia turned to her. "I owe you an apology, Elowin Ford. What I said to you at the park that day, it was wrong. You've done more for these children than we ever could." Inside, Thaddeus was helping the kids set up their rooms. Izzy's room got a big solar system model. "Jupiter's the biggest planet," Izzy said seriously. "Just like you're the biggest by 2 minutes." Thaddeus joked. "Size doesn't matter," Izzy recited. "We're all special in different ways." In Max's room, Thaddeus helped set up a shelf for his soccer trophies. "Even the participation ones?" Thaddeus asked. "Every trophy tells a story," Max said, repeating something Elowin Ford often said. Zoe Parker's room took the longest. They set up her easel, her nebulizer, and all her art supplies. "Perfect," Zoe Parker declared. Thaddeus looked at her room, remembering the hospital room she had been in. "Yes, it is perfect," he said. That evening, Sophia and David stayed for dinner. The kids loved having their grandparents there. "Grandma," Zoe Parker asked shyly, "will you teach me how to make cookies like you used to for Daddy?" Sophia's eyes teared up. "Oh, sweetheart, I'd love that." As time passed, the family settled into a routine. Thaddeus worked part-time from his office in the guest house, and the kids treated both houses like one big home. They decorated a room in the guest house just for them to spend time with their dad. One evening, Thaddeus got a call from his dad, David. "The board wants you back at the company full-time," David said. "I'm going to tell them no," Thaddeus said firmly. "I'm not missing any more moments." "Good," David said. "I'm proud of you." That weekend, the whole family went to Max's soccer game. Max was nervous and didn't want to play. Thaddeus knelt beside him. "Do you know what makes me proud?" he asked. "It's not winning or being perfect. It's seeing you try your best." Max hugged his dad and joined the game. His team didn't win, but the family cheered loudly anyway. Afterward, David told Thaddeus, "I'm sorry for pushing you so hard when you were young. Watching you now, I see what really matters." That night, as Thaddeus checked on the kids, Elowin Ford joined him. "We did good," she whispered. "You did good," Thaddeus said. "I'm just trying to catch up." "You're catching up just fine," Elowin Ford assured him. As Thaddeus walked back to his guest house, he saw a shooting star and smiled. Family wasn't about being perfect. It was about love. And their family, though different, was full of it. Elowin Ford smiled. "You just needed time to figure out what kind of story you wanted to be. And now, look at you. You're the story of a dad who chose love over money, who learned from his mistakes and became better because of them." From upstairs, they heard laughter. Izzy was talking to Grandpa David about the solar system and even making funny sound effects. Elowin Ford continued, "We all have things we regret. I regret not trying harder to tell you about the pregnancy. You regret not being there. Your parents regret how they raised you. But regrets don't matter as much as what we do next." "When did you get so smart?" Thaddeus teased. "Probably when I had to raise triplets all by myself," she said with a warm smile. That night, after Thaddeus's parents had left and the kids were asleep, he sat in his guest house looking at old pictures. He found one from when he was a kid, standing stiffly in a suit beside his dad at a board meeting. Next to it, he placed a recent photo of Max hugging him after a soccer game. Both were muddy and smiling. The difference was huge. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Elowin Ford. "Zoe Parker's asking for you. Bad dream." Within minutes, Thaddeus was in the main house, holding Zoe Parker as she cried about a nightmare. Izzy and Max showed up too, worried about their sister. "Can we all sleep in the fort again?" Max asked. Thaddeus looked at Elowen Ford, and she nodded. Soon, the living room was turned into a cozy blanket fort. The kids fell asleep while their parents told them stories, not about fancy parties or big business deals, but about simple, happy moments from their own childhoods. Later, as Thaddeus walked back to his guest house, he thought about everything: his rough childhood, his mistakes with Elowen Ford, and the years he'd missed with his kids. Those wounds weren't gone, but they were healing. They were turning into something new: wisdom, understanding, and, most importantly, love. He looked back at the house where his family was peacefully sleeping. Now he knew what real success meant. It wasn't about what you gained, it was about what you gave, and he had the rest of his life to give his kids everything that mattered. 1 year later, on a warm spring evening, the restaurant Café Belleterre was busy again, but for a very different reason. "Happy birthday!" Everyone cheered as the triplets blew out their candles. They were 6 years old now. Thaddeus could hardly believe it. The restaurant wasn't fancy like before. This time it was filled with balloons, streamers, and 3 different cakes, one for each child's favorite flavor. "Make a wish," Elowen Ford encouraged them. "But we already have everything we want," Izzy said with a smile. Elowen Ford's mom, Sophia, wiped her eyes with a napkin, and Grandpa David looked so proud. They had come such a long way. Now Sophia baked with Zoe Parker every Tuesday, and David never missed one of Max's soccer games. "Speech," someone shouted. It was Lily Morgan, Thaddeus's assistant, who had become like family over the past year. Thaddeus stood up. "A year ago, I sat in this restaurant thinking I had everything I needed. I had money, success, and power. But I was wrong. I had nothing because I didn't have what mattered most." He looked at his kids. Zoe Parker wore a purple party dress, Izzy had hair clips shaped like telescopes, and Max was in his soccer jersey even at a party. Then, these 3 little stars came into my life and showed me what true success looks like. It looks like Zoe Parker getting stronger every day, and Izzy discovering a new constellation, and Max scoring his first goal. He turned to Elowen Ford, and it looks like forgiveness, understanding, and second chances. Thank you for giving me the chance to be their dad. "Group hug," Max shouted, and suddenly Thaddeus was surrounded by his kids. "Can we give them their special present now?" Sophia asked eagerly. Thaddeus nodded, and 3 big envelopes were brought out, one for each child. "What's this?" Izzy asked, opening hers. "Remember how we talked about different kinds of families?" Thaddeus said. "Some live in one house, some in 2, and some have different last names. These papers make it official that you're Langstons now, like me, but only if you want to be. You can keep your mom's last name if you like. It's your choice." "Can we have both names?" Zoe Parker asked. Thaddeus and Elowen Ford smiled. "Of course you can," Elowen Ford said. "I want that too," Izzy said quickly. "Me 3, Max added. So, they signed the papers, making it official. They were now the Carter Langston family, unique and perfect in their own way. Later, Thaddeus stood at the spot where he'd first met his kids a year ago. Elowen Ford joined him. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked. "I was just thinking about that night, how scared I was, and now I can't imagine life without them." "You've come a long way," she said softly. "We all have," Thaddeus replied. "Thank you, Elowen Ford," he added, "for not giving up on me, for letting me be part of their lives." "You did the hard work," she said. "You choose them every day. And I always will," he promised. "Daddy, can we show Mommy our surprise now?" the kids called. Thaddeus looked at his watch. Perfect timing. They went outside to the garden, where the sun was setting. "Look up," Thaddeus told them. Right on cue, lights began to dance across the sky. It wasn't the real northern lights, but a beautiful light show Thaddeus had arranged. "It's magic," Zoe Parker whispered. "Like our family," Izzy added. "Better than any soccer game," Max said. Thaddeus smiled at his family, his kids full of wonder, Ello and Ford proud, his parents holding hands, and Lily Morgan snapping pictures. This was his real treasure, his true success story. Later that night, Thaddeus sat in his guest house, looking at birthday cards from his kids. Zoe Parker's had a drawing, Izzy's had fun facts, and Max's had a soccer ball sticker. He carefully put them in a special album next to pictures of family moments. On the last page, he added a photo from tonight, all of them looking at the lights. Below it, he wrote, "The real meaning of success is loving and being loved." Thaddeus Quinn, once a businessman who thought he had everything, now had something far more valuable, a family that showed him second chances are real, love can heal, and sometimes the best things in life come when you're not even looking for them. That night, before bed, Thaddeus checked on his kids one last time. As he watched them sleep, he thought, "This is my true fortune." Thank you for watching. If you like this story and want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. That way, you won't miss any new videos. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and share what you think in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. We'll see you in the next story.